My fellow Americans, this was not a riot. This was a massacre. Among the worst in our history, but not the only one. We do ourselves no favors by pretending none of this ever happened, or it doesn't impact us today, because it does still impact us today. We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides. And we're a great nation. The only way to build a common ground is to truly repair and to rebuild. I come here to help fill the silence, because in silence, wounds deepen. And only, as painful as it is, only in remembrance do wounds heal. We just have to choose to remember. We memorialize what happened here in Tulsa, so it can't be erased.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast. I'm Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, and it is my privilege to stand here before you today to host our virtual town hall, our Lunch and Learn, to explain to each and every one of you why it's so important to make sure that the historic Greenwood Black Wall Street district becomes designated as a national monument. I'm excited to welcome a lot of our colleagues and our support team to answer any question that you may have regarding this process, these efforts that's been going on, not just here recently, but for the last several years. We've been trying to make this happen, and it's long overdue. And so first, I want to just shout out Mr. Nehemiah Frank and the Black Wall Street Times for allowing us to broadcast this Lunch and Learn on the Black Wall Street Times. We can't say thank you enough. And to the Black Wall Street Coalition, thank you for all that you do. And so without further ado, I would like to bring on my co-chair and my partner, Mr. Reuben Gant, with the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation, to just share a few words and thoughts about why a national monument is so important for the historic Greenwood Black Wall Street District. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Gant.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. I'd just like to emphasize that this is not an effort that we thought of in the last 2 or 3 years to pursue, but it's something that we've been working on for many years, as Dr. Crutcher mentioned. And the emphasis of the focus is to really not have Greenwood defined because of one day, a tragedy that occurred in a community that was pursuing at the time what they considered to be the American dream. It doesn't define Greenwood. And this effort is to put Greenwood, the story of Greenwood, in its rightful place in American history. We live in a place where the most horrendous act of civil disobedience occurred that has been lost in the annals of history of America, of the United States. And our effort is to make sure, as the president just said, that it is never forgotten, and to be able to have this designation of a national monument will cement the Greenwood story in the annals of American history, so that the stories of the United States can be told adequately and fairly. So our intent here is to be informative, to be educational, hopefully to answer questions that are unanswered and questions that you may have today. But hopefully you will gather enough information that you will feel comfortable walking away realizing that this is a positive effort and a positive thing for Greenwood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. I appreciate that. And before we turn it over and get to this town hall, I just want to recognize our coalition partners that's joined this effort with us. I want to shout out the Historic Greenwood Main Street Foundation, again, the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation, the Terrence Crutcher Foundation, Langston University, OSU Tulsa, the Greenwood Chamber of Commerce, the historic Mount Zion Baptist Church, and the historic Vernon AME Church. And if I missed anyone, I'll make sure that I catch you at the end of this town hall. Once we do our call to action, we want to make sure that each and every one of you, that you know exactly how you can get involved with these efforts to make history in the state of Oklahoma. And so I want to turn it over to Mr. Kevin Bryan with Equiball Partners. And if I said that wrong, I want you to just repeat that so we can jump right into the conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Kevin Bryant, Equiball Partners. Really looking forward to supporting this effort today and in the future. What I'll do is help to moderate the conversation today. I'm going to try to be as nondescript as possible, but help make certain that the conversation flows well. In that sense, I want to start off by turning to Greg Robinson, who's going to give us a bit of an understanding as to why now, why do we want this effort at this moment in time. Greg?
Thank you, Kevin. And it's always humbling to be a part of this group, in particular with such a historic opportunity that we have. In answering that why, I do want to give a little bit of a timeline of how we've gotten here. You know, we opened with the video of President Biden speaking, and certainly he was the first president to come and speak in the Greenwood District. And his administration has made it really clear that they are looking to correct some wrongs, looking to properly commemorate history that has happened in this country that has not been commemorated. And certainly the story of Black Wall Street, as Mr. Gant said, the whole story of Black Wall Street is something that this administration has stated that they are interested in commemorating. And that really gives us the impetus for this work. The president is able to, under the powers of the Antiquities Act, declare national monuments, and it allows us the ability to really strike essentially while the iron's hot. And so while this is a process that has been ongoing for frankly decades, we've got a moment here. And we started, that's really what started the coalition that began to form with entities and community members that were stakeholders within the historic Greenwood District's area just in late 2022. We came together and set out a vision and created an initial letter that went out to the president that many coalition partners and community members were able to sign on to, essentially telling the president, hey, we as a Greenwood community are ready to get this process started. It was a push that was done by organizations from across the Greenwood area, and frankly, from folks across the aisle. I think even Mayor Bynum sent a letter at that time. We followed that up with a community meeting at Vernon AME, where we really initially gave some basic information, but really took in a lot of questions because at the time we were just getting started. And that then allowed for the coalition to begin to try and answer some of those questions. What is the benefit of a monument? What do we need to do to actually get that in place? And with the help of our friends who you're going to meet today, folks from the Sierra Club and Conservation Lands Foundation and so on, we took a trip up to Washington, D.C. In early March to really talk with the powers that be and get answers to those questions. The strategy that we were taking at that time was to try and get a national monument moving quickly and to go at two different pathways. We wanted to go through the legislative pathway. And so we spent time scheduling and meeting with legislators on both sides of the aisle, particularly our Oklahoma delegation, as well as wanting to pursue the Antiquities Act pathway. And so we were able to meet with representatives from the National Park Service and the Department of Interior at that time as well. Again, letting them know that this was something that we were interested in, that we will be galvanizing community and trying to understand what it is that we needed to do to be successful. We then came back, and in late March, we held a public meeting at the Greenwood Cultural Center, where we talked about what happened at that DC fly-in and began to really hone in on a couple of the big tasks that we need to accomplish as a community. I know at the end of this meeting, when we make our big public ask, that this is going to come up again, but I want to preview it. There are a few things that we need to do as a community. One is site identification. If we are able to identify 1, 2, or 3 sites that can be turned over to the federal government so that they can claim land, that gives the president what he needs to create that Antiquities Act and use that Antiquities Act and create that national monument. We also need to look at expanding the period of significance potentially. The National Park Service, when they did their first study, the period of significance that they used was 1905 to 1965. Okay. But we're looking at potentially being able to expand that to from 1820 to 1965. And that would allow us to tell a fuller story, a story that includes the Trail of Tears, a story that includes the freedmen and their contributions to Greenwood as well. And so I wanted to give that background to really answer Kevin's question about the why now. The reality is, from a political standpoint, this is the time to strike. You've got an administration who has created or who has set this as a priority. We've got history on our side, frankly, and we've got the 102-year anniversary coming up. And so everything is there for us to get this done if we can agree as a community on a few things to really set Washington, D.C. up in the way they need to be set up to move us forward here. I know we're going to dig into more of that today. And so, Kevin, I will give it back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Greg. I'm going to turn now to Gavin Noyes. He's one of the leaders over at Conservation Lands Foundation, who has been working with this group to help provide support, context, and background services around this process of identifying and securing national monument status. Let me turn to you, Gavin. You're going to walk through some slides to help explain this process a little bit more. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. If we could get the slide deck started. Well, first of all, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Greg, and Dr. Crutcher and Ruben for those introductions. My name is Gavin Noyes, and I'm with a group called the Conservation Lands Foundation. And we have worked for many years to create a lot of the national monuments under the Obama administration. And we're engaged in about 15 national monuments, mostly across the West. Our organization really believes in the power of grassroots communities and local voices to lead these efforts. And so my role and our organization's role in these campaigns is largely to support in the background and make sure the communities have good information to consider what's best and what they might want to do. And it's been a real honor for me to get to work with the Historic Greenwood Coalition, to get to know Tulsa, to get to know this really critical story in American history. And so what I want to do, what I'm going to do today is quickly go through some examples that I think are relevant to some of the questions that the community is facing right now. I want to just preface this to say that there's terms here that are going to be new. This is a very complicated process, and some of it is not really intuitive on how it works. But I'm going to say the nice thing about a national monument, and especially this administration and the National Park Service, is that they essentially come in as a community partner, and they work with the community to help realize your vision. But the private partnership piece of this is in many ways larger than the National Park Service piece. And so let's go to the next slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on three things, which are the boundary, what that is, what it means, what impacts it has, the federal site, which there's a requirement of one federal site in order to use the Antiquities Act. And then I'm going to talk about philanthropic partners. But I'm going to start with the National Park Service. And their role is really important because when a national monument is created, in this case, they will be the entity that manages the national monument. But that can look very differently in different places. In some places, the National Park Service might have no presence on the ground, no real staff, and they'll rely on partners to do the supportive work. They'll play other roles like interpretation, but in some cases they will have a very large presence. There's 484 national park units, and the Historic Greenwood National Monument would become another one of those. And so we'll go through some examples, but there's two things here. The Park Service thinks about cultural landscapes, and they define 800 different cultural landscapes across their 424 parks and monuments. And that term is also very confusing, and I included a link that maybe we can move across the screen. But there's some nice materials online that the Park Service explains what is a cultural landscape, and really it's a way of telling stories that can be abstract stories, or they can be tangible stories that you can go and look at. But they actually have a number of parks that they don't look like that much. But what they do with them is they interpret them and they tell the story in a way that really helps people connect and feel a part of it. And so I think really what you're asking for when you ask for a national monument is you're asking to be included in an American cultural storytelling platform that sets a certain standard. And so when visitors come to the Greenwood District, they are going to have some expectations that they're going to learn things. They're going to be able to see some things and experience something that they don't know about. So that's really the role of the National Park Service. And then I will dig into, with these examples coming up, what a philanthropic partner is. And again, this is a very complex and confusing term. It can be a small nonprofit that maybe gets 10 volunteers out to go and clean up a site. It can be somebody that raises money on behalf of this unit of the Park Service, and those monies would then go to support the interpretation, or this could be a museum like Greenwood Rising, or it could be It could be any number of nonprofits, but what you'll see if you really look into these National Park Service units is they all have philanthropic partners. And these partners sometimes play a very large role. And so when we say that the opportunity to create something really unique and different here in Tulsa, that's what we're talking about, is there's opportunities that will come 2 to 3 years down the road when the public process begins on creating a national monument plan, where really different entities from the community can come forward and say, hey, I want to be part of this, and this is neat. I think I can benefit it in this way. So next slide, please. So I'm first going to talk about a boundary, and the term boundary is confusing because typically people think when you put a boundary around something that the federal government somehow wants to own it. And there is no mechanism for the federal government to use eminent domain or anything to take land through this process. And I'll get into in a minute what the federal site is. But the boundary that surrounds a national monument, it does not impact other landowners. But what it does is it creates a reference for the period of significance, of historical significance. And so my first example out of 4 is Stonewall National Monument, which is in the Greenwich District of New York City. This is a highly urbanized area. And this is a really interesting national monument because it documents a riot that happened in 1969. This was a LGBTQ bar in New York City where patrons got harassed one Friday night by the police, and they were drag queens that were getting arrested, and one of the drag queens kicked one of the police officers and started this riot. And so it was a fight that took place inside and outside of the bar, and the whole community, when the police were trying to clear the bar, they all came in and tried to defend what was going on, which was violations of the rights of individuals who weren't harming anyone. And so this national monument, it commemorates that riot, which was, it actually started a louder and more boisterous gay rights movement where people protested in the park across the street from the bar for the next several days. And it also led to a march, which is often credited for the first gay pride march in the US. And so it's credited with really transforming the entire gay rights movement and really people becoming more open and vocal about how to assert those rights. And so it just celebrated its 50-year anniversary. And President Obama created this national monument. And so I'm going to show you a couple things on this map. You can see the kind of pentagon shape. The boundary is everything that is a little bit darker in color. And it basically defines a walking tour that is a self-guided tour. Anyone that goes to visit this neighborhood in New York City, they can download some materials, they can walk around, and they can view the different businesses that were involved in this moment in history and in the present. They have ice cream shops with Stonewall themes, and so it is kind of a tourist draw that people go and they learn about what happened here. But most of those dark areas that you see are New York City public streets and sidewalks. They're not federal property. And so the boundary defines where people should go, but the federal government has no control or no, it's just it's something on a map to help people tell the story of what happened here. And the thing I the federal site that got selected, you can see that triangle shape that's labeled number 2. That is Christopher Park. And there's a piece of public, or 2 pieces of public art in that park that were created long before the riot. But the federal government received that park, and so it owns it, and that allowed for them to create this national monument. They had to have the park. And you can see this photo on the left. It shows they have one park ranger who I think is part-time, and she recruits volunteers from the philanthropic partners, and they take care of the park. And so they keep it in good shape. They sometimes have events and things. But the really interesting thing about this national monument is that number 1 site is a building, and that is Stonewall Inn, which is the gay bar where the riot happened. And it has no federal ownership. There's no easement on it. It still operates as a bar, and it's open to the public when they decide to open up. But it is most definitely part of the monument because they've asked to be part of the monument. And so purely voluntary, but really no change in title or anything. And so this one I like because it kind of tells the story of what could happen in the Historic Greenwood District. You can set aside the entire 50+ block area as a boundary, and then you can get just one federal property donated, like this park, and then the community can come together to really be a part of it or not be a part of it in telling whatever stories and creating whatever visitor experiences that you might want, or create the next iteration of Black Wall Street, such as Black Tech Street, which you've heard about. So next slide, please. This is, I'll move through these other examples quicker, but this is Anniston, Alabama. This is the Freedom Riders National Monument, which is, again, if you look at the map on the right-hand side, there are 2 pieces of federal property. One is the bus depot, which is pictured as the brick building that's located in Anniston. And the second is an empty field, which you can see the historic photo of where the Ku Klux Klan and others stopped the bus of Freedom Riders, threw some burning rags inside, and set the bus on fire, and created havoc and again kind of sparked a whole movement of human rights and advocacy. That photo below that shows the green grass is the 2 photos below. Show where the bus was driven off of the road and burned. But what that site represents is, the National Park Service needs to own an artifact that it can protect, but it can also own the absence of an artifact. So in this case, it's just an empty field. And so for the Historic Greenwood District, so many buildings were burned. There's places where buildings once were that were thriving businesses that the Park Service could receive simply an easement over the open space and use that to tell the story of what happened in the Historic Greenwood District. You can see that these 2 sites are 7 miles apart from each other. Again, you can look at the boundary of the Park Service ownership on the upper left-hand part of the map, which shows the Park Service received a donation of those empty fields, and then they drew a boundary around it. But again, the streets are not part of the federal ownership. There's still right-of-ways, and so these are examples. There's a lot of creative ways that the federal government can be brought in, but they just need one site to create a monument that would be a tribute to everything that happened in the Greenwood District. So next slide, please. So the third example is the Reconstruction Era National Monument. And actually, this is my final example. This one is in Beaufort, South Carolina. And this is the most complicated national monument that I'll mention. It started out as 4 sites, and they're all in Beaufort, South Carolina. And let me just read you. So the interesting one is the left-hand photo, which is called the Brick Baptist Church. This was donated by a nonprofit called the Penn Center. And you can see the middle map there is the Penn Center National Historic Landmark District. So again, we have an external boundary where the Park Service and federal government really have they have no control or ownership. But within that boundary, they received, in that district, they received a form of ownership in 2 properties. Well, the Black Baptist Church, the Penn Center only donated the exterior facade of the building. And what that means is that every Sunday, the Penn Center still uses it as a Baptist church. Functions go on as they always have, but the facade is, the Park Service helps maintain it, make sure it's restored, and they're responsible for making it look good on the outside so that visitors can come and take pictures. But the inside of the church is fully owned and operated by the Penn Center. So that's one example of what could happen in the Greenwood District is a nonprofit or an entity could donate the exterior of a building as an easement for a facade or for some architectural element. And that gives the federal government enough of a hook to create a national monument. But there were 4 properties that were donated in Beaufort, South Carolina. The old Beaufort Firehouse, which I don't have a picture of here, it was owned by Billy and Paul Kieserling, and they fully donated the building to the National Park Service. And through the planning process, the community and the Park Service decided to make that the visitor center. Oh, I do have a picture of it. It's that far right-hand one. So that's the old Beaufort Firehouse, which was donated at the time it became a national monument. And there's a couple other sites that were also donated. One was the Robert Smalls House, which was already designated as a National Historic Landmark. And that one was nice because all that the Park Service had to do was transfer the existing historic preservation easement over to a Park Service easement, but all the rules and regulations were the same. And I am aware that in the Historic Greenwood District, there are several places that are already designated as a National Historic Landmark, which the Park Service has a role in at least listing those sites. Those easements, which already restrict some of the things that can happen to those buildings, are enough to transfer over to the Park Service, allow them to own that easement, and then that could allow for the creation of a national monument. And so those are the 3 examples. Next slide, please. I really want to encourage everyone to go online to look at all of these different sites that you see here and see where they're at. You know, some of these new ones like Stonewall and Freedom Riders and even Reconstruction era, you'll see on their websites that they list their philanthropic partners. And they say things like on the Freedom Riders website, it says, quote, Freedom Riders National Monument is a new national park unit located in Anniston, Alabama. It is a park in progress with limited services. In the coming years, services will be added to the park in cooperation with our partners. And what that tells you is that they're still in the process of the community engagement. They're still negotiating what roles different public partners have, what kinds of stories to tell, how to do the interpretation. So they're not quite ready for visitors to come, and have the support of the community and the Park Service. But they're developing that, and they'll do that in a way that is going to work for the community. Next slide, please. So that's really the summary of what I wanted to cover in what a boundary is, which again has no impact on the private properties within the boundary. What a federal site is, which one site is needed in order to create a national monument through the Antiquities Act. The federal legislation, which I think we'll be able to share with you through it'll be on the Black Wall Street Coalition website, hopefully later today. But the legislation does not require a federal site, so you can have a national monument without naming a site. And then the final thing is the philanthropic partners, which are all of you in the community, that there are ways to volunteer and get involved and donate services or donate spaces or funds to help make this a success. And we also have a federal site memo that we will put on the Black Wall Street Coalition .org website later today as well, that goes through everything that I just covered. I also wanted to just introduce Kai Anderson, and Ethan Manuel. Kai is with Cassidy and Associates in Washington, D.C. Ethan Manuel is with the Sierra Club. And there's a lot of things that I might have missed. And so please jump in and add anything that might help everyone in the community there see ways that they can get involved and be part of this. Thank you.
So Gavin, I think this is Kai Anderson. I think Gavin gave an excellent overview, and I would just add a couple of things. First, an observation based on his presentation, which I think is true here, which is that monuments come in all shapes and sizes, and done right, they are driven by community and facilitated by the Park Service. And the effort that the Greenwood Coalition has been pursuing, I think, reflects all that is best in that process. Again, locally driven with a Park Service partner at the end of the day to help tell a story that is obviously an Oklahoma story, but it's truly a national story also, and one that the country needs to know and hear. And so I would just add one other thing, which is that Greg alluded to the effort to have the president use the Antiquities Act to create a national monument here. And it's certainly a point of opportunity given the political lay of the land. But there are two pathways to monument designation. One is using the Antiquities Act, as was described, and the other is through congressional designation. And the two things are not mutually exclusive. The example that Gavin used from Reconstruction era National Monument was a monument that was created by President Obama that was later then recharacterized in a bill passed by, championed by Mr. Clyburn, Jim Clyburn from South Carolina, and ratified by the Congress. So there are multiple pathways, and there are requirements for both of them. But it's important that the coalition sort of pursue both at the same time, in part because for an Antiquities Act designation to be done by the president, there's a desire by the administration, this administration in particular, but by all presidential administrations, that there's congressional support of some sort. And so the coalition's been pushing forward on both fronts in an effort to develop that kind of support. But there are two pathways. And again, there's lots of flexibility in what the ultimate outcome is.
Yeah, and Gavin and Kai, this is Ethan Manuel, Sierra Club. Great to be with everyone here. Yeah, I thought just to back up, I thought Greg gave a great overview of where we are, and just to reiterate what Greg was talking about, how this is a community-led effort. We're going to listen to folks on this call who are going to decide how this monument is shaped and what how it comes together. So thanks to Greg for that excellent overview. And I thought, again, like Kai said, Gavin did a great job with the overview, with the description of how, with those examples. The one other really good example that mimicked some of the ones Gavin already shared is the Birmingham Civil Rights Monument in Birmingham, Alabama, which kind of like some of the other examples has a boundary where where the Park Service encourages people to walk that neighborhood and learn about the struggle for civil rights that was centered there in Birmingham. And so it would be, this proposal could potentially mimic that, where the Park Service would encourage people to walk the 35 blocks of the Historic Greenwood District to learn about the accomplishments of Black Wall Street. But it wouldn't be, that 35 block radius would not be the National Monument. The monument would be a mix of those private sites that Gavin talked about that would be voluntarily donated to the park system. And Birmingham's a good example too, because it has in addition to having a boundary, it has a conservation easement for a couple of churches. It's got a hotel that was private property that was donated to the Park Service. So there's a lot of great examples that we're looking to mimic as we put this proposal together to present to the president for and take exact designation as a monument. But thanks for everybody for being on here. Thanks for a great panelists so far. And of course, special thank you, of course, to Dr. Crutcher and Ruben Gant for leading the effort there in Tulsa.
Great, thank you, everyone. Appreciate all the information that you've been able to offer to us. We want to dive into some questions that have come to us through the chat function. And we're going to encourage you, if you have a question that you would like to provide, that you'd like to have answered, we'll have our team here do its very best to provide the answer. If we don't have an answer for that question today, we will work to get one for you. Before I do that, I'm actually going to take a little liberty here. Are there any points that any of you, as you have been thinking, as you've heard the presentation here, are there any points that any of you here on the stage, on the virtual stage, want to raise? Any specific points that you want to make certain that that our audience can hear any comments on? I'm just going to open it up to our folks on the stage.
Thank you, Kevin, for allowing us to do that. I want to just really sort of go back and just raise the point about the boundaries of a national monument. Gavin, you talked about, I think, Stonewall and showed us the map, and I think it's vitally important that people understand when they come to the Historic Greenwood District that it's just not Black Wall Street. It's just not the street of Greenwood, but it was 35 to 40 square blocks that was burnt to the ground. There was a community, a residential community where people lived, my great grandmother, our families. And so they need to know that it's just not one street, but it's definitely an entire district that people need to know about when they come, and not just the 100 block, not just one church or two churches, but there were multiple churches that were alive and well during that time. And so Greg talked about, those timelines, or that timeline of significance, but I want to just make sure that people know that there's a northern boundary, there's a southern boundary, there's a western boundary, and there's an eastern boundary. And we want for people to know the entire story when they come here. And so just really understanding what that footprint will look like here in this district as the national monument, I think is vitally important.
Thank you. Anyone else that wants to jump in, add anything? Great. Let me do this. Let me just start looking through a couple of questions. One question that I see in the chat: what safeguards are in place to prevent a presidential administration or other partisan federal actors from politicizing a National Park Service monument in the future? Not certain if I fully understand the question, but I wonder if any of our panelists on the stage want to take a stab at that.
I'm happy to talk a little bit in parallel to it and monetize one of the great thinkers in our community. So thank you for the question. A few questions that have come up along this line that I want to dive into here a little bit, Kevin.
Mhm.
You know, what safeguards are in place from the standpoint of controlling what happens with this monument? That's been a big question, right? And so, one of the things that happens when the national monument is created is that the National Park Service comes in and they begin talking to private landowners about utilizing the space or making the space a site. But what also occurs is that there is an advisory that is created at the federal level. And I know that Gavin and some others can really get the details in if I miss something here. But my understanding of that advisory is that it is a combination of landowners, of stakeholders within the area that work alongside the folks at the federal level, representatives from the National Park Service and so on, to ensure that any decisions that are made to the national monument actually go through a community advisory process and lens, right? And so it is not as if the federal government or anyone at that level can just do something without going through that advisory process. And that also, my understanding, has to do with the appropriations as well. We know that appropriations come through the Congress, but even in the submitting or in the requesting of certain appropriations, that is something that should go through an advisory process. And that is something that we certainly had asked about. I do think the other thing I want to lift up here is that I'm looking at the word political, and the reality is there is a political nature to this. It's the reason that we're pushing currently to try and get this done. It's the reason that we feel that the Antiquities Act is something that is certainly at play. And so I do think we've like to be transparent about what we can control and frankly what we can't control. But I think that by doing this in a community-driven way, that because it would be created out of a want of community, that then the decisions that are made should be foundationally rooted in that this is a process that's been driven by community from the onset, and that should be driven by community throughout, right? But politics is certainly a part of all of this. I would argue that politics, frankly, is one of the reasons why we have not had the recognition and the monument to date. And so finally, we may have a glimmer of politics that might actually help us for once, and maybe we can use that to push this through. So I don't know if that's a perfect answer to the question, but I did want to use it as an opportunity to just bring out those two elements of this conversation as well.
Thank you, Greg. I wonder if anyone else any of the other folks on the stage here want to provide comment.
Well, Kevin, the only thing I would add to Greg's excellent answer is that once you're part of the park system, it does become, the story is institutionalized, right? And so you did see President Trump try and push back on some monuments that he didn't like that were dedicated to indigenous people's history, for instance, but he didn't succeed in that effort. So you can never say never, but I think once the park system, with local input, the way Greg described it, from this local advisory board that would be established to help guide the management plan for this monument, once it's established, once they're telling your story, it is hard to push back on it. And the park system does a really good job of telling uncomfortable parts of American history, whether it's Reconstruction or civil rights or Japanese internment camps. We have national parks that are Japanese internment camps, so they don't shy away from our history. They play it straight. So I think once you're institutionalized as part of that narrative that the Park Service is very good about telling, it's hard to politicize it or to push back on it once it's part of that system.
Thank you, Ethan.
Yeah,
Gavin, do you want to jump in?
This is Gavin, and both of those are just great observations. And I think Greg, especially just talking about the realities of things on the ground in Oklahoma. I'm in Utah, where we've done some of these indigenous national monuments, and they can get very politicized. But there's an urgency to creating a national monument for the Greenwood District now, because you have an administration who's very committed to seeing the community have the controls that the president can provide over this, which is that federal advisory committee, setting that up in the right way so that it's comprised of descendants and Greenwood community members, and isn't comprised of state delegation or others that might not have the clarity of vision. But I think that the next phase of this, so getting a proclamation that really elevates the local community and put structures in place so that you have as much control as possible. And then that next 2 to 3 year planning process is going to be really critical. And again, getting that started, during the Biden administration, I think there'll be more space to keep it from getting politicized. But, anytime you have money involved and different interests, there's going to be tensions. And so I will say that there's examples that we might be able to bring in at later community conversations from Beaufort, South Carolina. Gentrification is always an issue. They've done some interesting things there to try and protect the African American community members. But it's always an issue, and I think something that this community is particularly aware of, and there's things that can be done to protect that, but it's something you got to watch for sure. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's go to a couple of other questions in the chat. One question I see here being asked, with some of the land within a possible boundary owned by Tulsa, what role will our city government need to play? Does anyone want to take a chance on that question?
That is one that we've asked a lot about, and I think Gavin went over this, but I appreciate the question. When you're looking for land that the federal government can utilize in terms of the national monument piece, that's something that has to be donated, and it cannot be donated from a governmental entity to another governmental entity. And so if a site was to be donated that is currently owned by the city of Tulsa, it would need to utilize a third party, a nonprofit organization of some kind, to essentially operate as a pass-through. That is something that there are examples of. It would not be difficult to do if that was the case, but the city or any governmental entity cannot donate land to the federal government for this particular use of being a national monument.
Yeah, thank you. Couple of other questions. First of all, does anyone else want to respond to that question? Great. Then let me go to another question that we have here. Properties or structures donated for the monument, do they help? And I'm assuming that they would be the federal government. Do they help with upkeep or repairs? Does anyone want to respond quickly to that, to provide the answer to that?
I can respond to that. That's a great question, and there's the short answer is yes, they do help with repairs and upkeep. If they receive, like that facade that I mentioned in Beaufort for the Brick Baptist Church, they would be primarily responsible for raising the funds and doing the upkeep to those National Park Service very high standards. So that is one of the benefits of donating a facade easement to the Park Service, is that they do come in and do that. But I also want to point out that If this moves through the Antiquities Act, there is no federal funding that comes along with it. And so it basically has to compete with other Park Service funds. And that's one of the benefits of trying to get things done legislatively is you can put funding support in there. But yes, the Park Service, if they have a role and they have ownership, they are legally required to protect the artifacts or the absence of artifacts in those locations. And so they would put money into making sure that things don't fall into disrepair. And they'll do that with their community partners as well. They might seek request help doing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Appreciate that. Another question in the chat. 1920 census records indicate that Greenwood may possibly have been much larger than the roughly 35 blocks that were burnt. How will the boundary be determined? I know there's quite a bit of activity that's already gone in. Do you all want to share a little bit of information about that?
I think what might be referring to is the presence of Blacks beyond the northern boundary of Greenwood in a community that was known as a neighborhood that was known as Pershing, actually, at the time. But Greenwood received its moniker or its name from actually the development and the partnership of development between O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford. So they were responsible principally for developing the 35 blocks that comprised the Greenwood neighborhood. And that refers back to really the 40 acres of land that was purchased by O.W. Gurley with the promise of only selling to Black ownership. So that really defined in the reconnaissance survey study the initial general area of the Black community of Greenwood in the early 1900s. But Blacks did live outside of those boundaries and the perimeter of those boundaries, which might be a reference here.
Thank you. Are there others that want to respond?
So, Kevin, this is Kai. I would just add that part of the reason for using the 35 block area was that the Park Service has already studied it, as Mr. Gant just referenced, in a 2005 report that found that indeed the Greenwood neighborhood would be a good candidate for a National Monument designation. And so, I think we've been careful to recognize and understand that the ultimate boundaries could be bigger and or different. But there's already been substantial agreement on, at a minimum, the 35 block Greenwood neighborhood that was outlined in that 2005 report.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, if I could just add here, because this is not only the boundary, but also the time of significance, period of significance, as we call it, particularly with Black history and with history that, frankly, there was a conspiracy of silence around. There are a number of different valid, pathways to discovering that. I think that the important thing here that Kai is underlining is that the boundary that is selected itself is not a locked in, immovable object. And so when we're talking about expanding the period of significance from 1905 even back to 1820, that in itself expands, the conversation around who's impacted there and what story we're telling. And also when you stretch to 1965, now you're talking about a story of where did those Blacks that encompass Greenwood that was burned down, where did they go as well, right? And so there is a history that needs to be uncovered, certainly, and told to the best of our abilities. but it also is not something that cannot be amended, particularly with the discovery of artifacts and things that are brought to the surface that show the truth of the Greenwood District. So I just don't want this to feel like we're locking ourselves into something and can never get out of it within this conversation. That's really what I wanted to stamp there.
And if I could just add, Greg, to what you're saying, you know, we're not really locking ourselves in. I mean, we're talking about, you know, interpretive sites as well. We're talking about anything that's connected to the massacre, like possibly mass graves and so on and so forth. All of that can be connected to this story. What we're simply trying to do is tell a story and preserve a story that, quite frankly, was erased from our history books. We didn't learn about it at Carver. We didn't learn about it at Booker T. No one knew about it. I didn't even know I was a descendant. And so we're simply trying to preserve a story and disrupt this conspiracy of silence and disrupt these laws that are running rampant across our country to prevent us from telling our history. And to me, that's a form of repair, right? And so it's not just about money, but I want to make sure that we preserve not just the tragedy of what happened in 1921, but also the triumph, the community resilience, the ingenuity, the Black excellence that once existed right here in Greenwood. And so I know we have more questions, but we are pretty much at time. And so if I could, Kevin, I would like to jump into the call of action. And if you didn't get your questions answered, we're going to do this again at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we're also going to make sure that we rebroadcast this Lunch and Learn for those of you who weren't able to join us. But I want to give you all a call to action. If you want to learn more, if you want to get involved, please go to blackwallstreetcoalition.org, blackwallstreetcoalition.org. There is a petition that is going around. You can sign that petition to the president, as Kai spoke earlier about. There's two different pathways. There's two different routes that we're trying to actually do simultaneously, and that's get the president to sign an executive order via the Antiquities Act, or to get Congress to introduce a bill. And so we're doing that at the same time. And so we need you to join this movement. Also, you can write a letter of support. We have so many people. I named some of those organizations a little bit earlier that's signed on to this this letter to President Biden. And also there's been organizations that's actually written their own letter. You can do the same thing. We have the Oklahoma State chapter of the NAACP that turned in a letter. We have people from all across this country who's actually supporting this effort right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Austin African American Business Networking Association. We have the National Main Street organization. We have the Congressional Black Caucus, who's going to be sending in a letter. I had the privilege of talking with Mark Marial with the National Urban League. And also here locally, we have support from the city of Tulsa and the mayor. The city council actually signed a resolution and approved it. We're excited about that. The Tulsa County Commission. And then my sorority, the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, they had their Midwestern Regional Conference. They did a video, they did a call to action, and we have so much support. And so we want for you all to get involved. Go to blackwallstreetcoalition.org, sign the petition, send in a letter of support. You can actually send that letter to Ruben Gant or to myself, and that should be on the website. And if not, we'll actually put it in the chat for you to actually send those letters over to us. And also, we want you to know that at 5 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time, we will do this again. It will be Drive Time University. So if you're in rush hour, you'll have something to listen to and learn. And I'm excited about that. And I want to give a shout out. I forgot to mention some of our coalition partners, the Greenwood Cultural Center. They are a part of this very important coalition, the Greenwood Rising Center, and also the Oklahoma Center for Justice, OCCJ, where Phil Armstrong is the executive director. So again, you all join this movement. It is long overdue. And guess what? It is urgent. It is urgent. We have 3 living survivors who are 108, 108, and 102. And they clawed their way through the worst times in this nation's history to arrive at this moment. And as we approach the 102nd anniversary, we want to get this done for them. We want to center them. We want to get this done for the descendants. We want to get this done for the community. We know that if it gets right or gets done right in Tulsa, we can get it right anywhere. We are the microcosm of what's happening. We are the epicenter. And so we want to make sure that this story is told far and it's told wide. And so thank you all for joining us today. I saw Dr. or Pastor Todd Freeman, my friend Andre Wilson from over in Lawton, Mana, who's in Mexico right now, joining us from Mexico. I saw Nate Morris, and I saw Dr. Odawale, who's an archaeologist. You all, there's so much momentum right now with this effort, and I'm super excited. And so again, join us on this same platform, same time, same place at 5 p.m. Central, and we will be back to get your questions answered. So again, thank you so much for your time. I know we all have to get back to work. So we'll see you again. Nehemiah, I'll turn it over to you.
My fellow Americans, this was not a riot. This was a massacre. Among the worst in our history, but not the only one. We do ourselves no favors by pretending none of this ever happened, or it doesn't impact us today, because it does still impact us today. We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides. And we're a great nation. The only way to build a common ground is to truly repair and to rebuild. I come here to help fill the silence, because in silence, wounds deepen. And only, as painful as it is, only in remembrance do wounds heal. We just have to choose to remember. We memorialize what happened here in Tulsa, so it can't be erased.